Imagine the greatest warrior alive, your city's only hope, is struck down by a poisoned arrow just before the final battle. His army is about to shatter. But his wife, instead of mourning, carries out his last, most horrific command. With cold precision, she dresses his corpse in armor, straps his dead body to his horse, and sends the lifeless hero to lead the charge. This is the true story of how a dead man won a war, and the grotesque act of love that made it possible. The dead man rode at the head of the army. His body, encased in steel plate, was lashed securely to the saddle, the empty sockets of his helm staring forward at the enemy camp sprawling beneath the walls of Valencia. Thousands of warriors followed their lifeless general, their hearts a maelstrom of superstitious dread and a strange, desperate resolve. The wind whipped his banner, the one bearing the rampant lion, and this silent leader guided them into one last, impossible battle. The only sounds were the jangle of mail, the thud of hooves on the dry earth, and the collective, held breath of an army marching behind a corpse. No shouted orders cut through the tension, no rallying cry stirred their blood. There was only the rhythmic, relentless advance and the sight of their commander, a rigid icon of war, leading them from beyond the veil of death. Each soldier felt the cold grip of the unnatural, yet they marched on, their loyalty a chain that bound them even to this macabre charade. From the enemy ramparts, the morning haze first obscured the approaching force. Then, as the sun climbed higher, the spectacle resolved into a horrifying tableau. They saw the familiar banner, the renowned warhorse, and the unmistakable silhouette of the champion they believed was already claimed by death. A murmur of disbelief rippled through their ranks, quickly turning to a wave of primal fear. It was not an army they faced, but a ghost, a legend given terrifying form. His wife had performed her duty with a chilling precision. Her hands had not trembled as she buckled the last strap of his armor over the cooling flesh, nor as she positioned his gauntlet hand upon the reins. She had looked into the vacant space behind the visor, a place where a loving gaze once met hers, and saw only the path to a victory born from deceit and despair. Her grief was a cold, hard stone in her chest, a weight that fueled this final, grotesque act of devotion and strategy. The horse, Babieka, moved with a purpose that defied the lifeless burden it carried. The great warhorse, which had charged into countless battles with its master, seemed to understand the gravity of this last ride. It needed no guidance, its path unerring, its powerful stride eating up the ground that separated the two armies. The animal itself had become a part of the terrifying legend, the loyal steed carrying its spectral rider to a final judgment. For the men who followed, faith and fear were now the same thing. They had pledged their swords to a man, and now they followed his corpse. The tales of his prowess, his invincibility, were a comfort and a curse. They were marching into history, into a story that would be told in whispers for centuries, a tale of a dead commander whose very presence could break an army. They were instruments of a dead man's will, their own lives a small price for the myth they were forging. As the distance closed, the features of the enemy soldiers became clear, faces pale with terror, eyes wide with the certainty of seeing a damned soul. Their lines, once orderly and confident, began to waver. The sight of the silent, unyielding figure at the head of the charge was a poison seeping into their courage. This was not a man they could kill, for he was already dead. It was an omen, a divine judgment riding down upon them, and against such a force, their swords and spears were useless. The final charge began not with a roar, but with a surge of motion, a silent, inexorable wave of steel and flesh cresting towards the shore of the enemy line. The dead man at its apex did not raise his sword. He did not cry out for glory or for God. He simply rode on, a vacant, terrifying effigy of war, his empty gaze fixed on the victory he would not see, leading the living into a battle that already belonged to the dead. Only a few years before, the name Rodrigo Diaz de Vivar was a shield for Castile. It was a name spoken with reverence in the halls of power and with fear in the camps of his enemies. He was the king's champion, the embodiment of Christian martial virtue, his loyalty as unyielding and as sharp as the edge of his own legendary sword. That was before the whispers began. They slithered through the royal court like venomous asps, born of jealousy and nurtured by fear of his growing influence. The words were poison, accusing him of skimming tribute owed to the crown, a lie carefully crafted to strike at the heart of his honor. A man of his stature was a threat to lesser men who coveted his position. The judgment was delivered not in a court of his peers, but in the cold, unfeeling chamber of the king he had served so faithfully. King Alfonso, his face a mask of regal indifference, spoke the word that severed a lifetime of service: exile. The charge was treason, a brand seared onto his reputation, turning hero into outcast with a single royal decree. He did not beg for mercy or plead his innocence. His pride was a fortress that no royal edict could breach. He stood before the throne, his gaze steady, accepting the injustice with a silence more profound than any protest. He saw the truth in the shifting eyes of the courtiers, the flicker of triumph in his rivals. He was a lion being driven from his own pride. His departure was a somber procession. He left his home, the lands that had been in his family for generations, with nothing but his horse, his armor, and his sword. He turned his back on the life he had known, on the kingdom he had bled for, and rode towards an uncertain future, a king unto himself, but a king of nothing. A small band of men, a brotherhood forged in the crucible of countless battles, refused to abandon him. They were bound not by fealty to a crown, but by loyalty to a man. They chose the hardship of exile with their commander over the comfort of a kingdom that had betrayed him. Their faces were grim, but their resolve was absolute. The road ahead was a blank map, a wilderness of shifting allegiances and constant danger. The name that had once been his shield was now his only currency. His skill in warfare, his tactical genius, his fearsome reputation, these were the assets he now carried to an open market, a marketplace where loyalty was sold to the highest bidder. His sword, Tizona, which had flashed in the sun for the glory of Castile and the Christian faith, now felt cold and heavy in his hand. It was no longer a symbol of patriotic duty. It had become a tool, an instrument of his trade. Its purpose was no longer to defend a kingdom, but to secure his own survival and the fortunes of the men who followed him. The transformation from patriot to mercenary was not a sudden fall, but a gradual hardening of the soul. Each sunrise brought the same cold reality: he was a sword for hire. The ideals that had once fueled his spirit were ashes, replaced by a cold, clear pragmatism. His honor was now a personal code, detached from any flag or king. News of his exile traveled fast, carried on the winds of rumor and the tongues of merchants. In the Moorish taifas, the petty kingdoms of Al-Andalus, his name was already a legend. They had faced his charge in battle, felt the sting of his strategies. They called him El Cid, the Lord, a title of respect given by the very enemies he had once fought. In the opulent courts of Zaragoza, the Emir al-Mu'tamin listened to these tales with keen interest. He was a shrewd ruler, beset by rivals both Muslim and Christian. He needed a military commander of unparalleled skill, but he was wary of the treacherous politics of his own nobility. A powerful general from within his own ranks could easily become a threat to his throne. Rodrigo Diaz de Vivar presented a perfect solution. A Christian champion, exiled and without a master, would have no political ambitions within the Saracen court. His loyalty would be simple, transactional. He would fight for gold, not for power or influence. He was a perfect weapon, free of local entanglements. And so, a message was sent, an invitation extended from the Muslim emir to the exiled Christian knight. It was an offer of gold and command, a chance to practice the only art he had ever truly known. For Rodrigo, it was not a matter of faith or betrayal, but of necessity. His sword needed a purpose, and his men needed a patron. He rode into Zaragoza not as a conqueror, but as a contractor. He saw the alien beauty of the city, the intricate tile work of the Aljaferia Palace, the minarets that pierced the sky. It was a world entirely different from the stern stone castles of Castile, a world of sensuous art and complex scholarship. He observed it all with a detached warrior's eye. The meeting with al-Mu'tamin was an exercise in mutual assessment. The emir saw before him a man forged from steel, his eyes holding the cold light of 1,000 battlefields. Rodrigo saw a refined, intelligent ruler who understood the nature of power. No grand speeches were made. It was a negotiation of terms, a weighing of value. The pact was sealed. The Christian knight, the former champion of Castile, swore to lead the armies of the Muslim emir of Zaragoza. His banner, with its lion, would now fly alongside the crescent moon. His first task was to defend Zaragoza from its enemies, which included the Christian king of Aragon and the Count of Barcelona. There was a bitter irony in his new role. To earn his pay, he now drew his sword against the very men with whom he shared a faith. He led Muslim armies against Christian forces, shattering their formations with the same brutal efficiency he had once used against the Moors. He was simply a force of war, an instrument of victory for whoever paid his price. He did not revel in these victories. They were tasks completed, contracts fulfilled. With each battle won, his legend grew, but his soul became more isolated. He was a stranger in a strange land, fighting for a cause that was not his own, his heart a cold, empty chamber where the fires of patriotism had long since died out. His name became a terror to his former allies. The Count of Barcelona, Ramon Berenguer II, a proud and arrogant man, met him in battle and was soundly defeated and captured. Rodrigo treated his noble prisoner with courtesy but ransomed him for a fortune. War was his business, and he conducted it with a professional's dispassionate skill. The gold piled up in his coffers. He rewarded his men handsomely, ensuring their loyalty remained as sharp as their blades. He was no longer just a warrior, he was a prince of mercenaries, a power in his own right, his influence built not on inherited land but on the fear and respect his sword commanded. Yet, in the quiet hours of the night, when the sounds of the foreign city filled his ears, the ghost of Castile would return. He would remember the feel of his own lands under his feet, the faces of the people he had sworn to protect, the cold eyes of the king who had cast him out. He was El Cid, the Lord, but he was a lord without a home. The fury he unleashed upon the battlefield knew no allegiance. It was a pure, elemental force, a storm of steel and strategy that he directed with the same cold detachment whether his banner flew for a Christian king or a Muslim emir. The intricate dance of warfare was his only true language now, the only catechism he still understood. He dissected armies with the precision of a master butcher. He would watch the enemy lines form, his gaze sweeping over them not as a collection of men, but as a series of problems to be solved. A weakness in the flank, an overconfident cavalry charge, a poorly chosen piece of ground, these were the flaws he would exploit with brutal, unforgiving efficiency. His victories became a relentless drumbeat across the fractured landscape of Iberia. He shattered the forces of the Count of Barcelona, then turned his tactical genius to crushing the rebellious armies of a rival emir allied with the Kingdom of Aragon. To the men who followed him, his cause was irrelevant, victory was their only creed, and he was its sole prophet. Fame followed him like a shadow, and wealth flowed in its wake. He was paid in chests of gold dinars, in silks from the distant east, in grants of land and castles he had no intention of calling home. The spoils of war were piled high in his tents, a glittering testament to his success that brought him no warmth, no solace. For in the quiet moments after the slaughter, a profound emptiness would descend upon him. He would stand on a captured rampart, looking out over a field littered with the dead, and feel nothing. There was no glory in this, no sense of righteous purpose. It was merely a transaction, a service rendered for a price paid in blood and gold. He was a phantom in the opulent courts of his employers. He moved through halls of intricate tile and perfumed gardens, a figure of iron amidst silk. The emirs and viziers treated him with a cautious, fearful respect, valuing his sword arm but never truly accepting the Christian warrior into their world. He was a tool, exquisitely sharp and dangerous, but a tool nonetheless. He was a stranger to their customs, an observer of their faith. He watched them prostrate themselves in prayer towards a distant, holy city he did not know, and the gulf between his world and theirs seemed infinite. He was a lord among them, El Cid, yet he was more isolated than the lowest-ranking soldier in his own army. His home had ceased to be a place on a map. It was not the rolling hills of Castile, whose memory now brought only a dull ache. His home was the creak of saddle leather, the clang of the armorer's hammer, the nervous energy of the war camp before dawn. His home was the brief, violent clarity of the battlefield. Any dream of returning to the land of his birth withered with each new campaign. The stories that drifted back were twisted and ugly. In Castile, he was no longer a wronged hero, he was a traitor, a renegade who had sold his Christian soul to the infidel. Each victory for Zaragoza drove the nails deeper into the coffin of his past life. He knew that King Alfonso would never recall him now. His success had made him too powerful, too independent. An exiled, defeated knight might one day be pardoned. A mercenary prince who commanded armies and held the fate of kingdoms in his hand was not a subject to be forgiven, but a rival to be feared. So he learned to kill the part of himself that still yearned for home. He walled off the memories, burying them under the foundations of his new life. His loyalty was now a simple, brutal thing, given only to the small brotherhood of warriors who had followed him into exile and to the gold that paid for their swords. He ate their bread, slept under their roofs, and fought their battles, but he was a ghost haunting their world. His heart had become a fortress, its gates barred even to himself. The man who had been Rodrigo Diaz de Vivar was gone, replaced by the legend of El Cid, a figure of mythic prowess and profound, terrifying emptiness. The fury he unleashed in battle was the only honest thing he had left. It was not born of hatred for his enemies, but from the cold, dead core of his own soul. It was a way to feel something, anything, other than the gnawing void. In the heart of the melee, with his life hanging by a thread, he was, for a few fleeting moments, truly alive. His lieutenants saw the change in his eyes. The warmth that had once been there was gone, replaced by a glacial calm that was more unsettling than any rage. They followed him without question, their loyalty absolute, but they mourned the men he had been, even as they profited from the unstoppable warrior he had become. He became a force of nature, a shift in the balance of power that kings and emirs had to account for. He was no longer fighting for a master, but for himself. His army was his kingdom, his will was its only law. He was a king without a crown, a lord without a land, a hero without a cause. In the dead of night, he would sometimes stand alone, staring up at the same cold stars that shone down on Castile. He would feel the weight of all the lives he had taken, both Christian and Muslim, and the vast, unbridgeable distance between what he was and what he had been. The past was a foreign country, and he knew he could never go back. But the tapestry of fate is woven with threads of irony. From the scorched plains of North Africa, a new power had risen, a force of zealous, unyielding faith. They were the Almoravids, and they swept into Al-Andalus not to forge alliances, but to purify and to conquer. They were a tide of fire and steel, and the petty Taifa kingdoms crumbled before them. King Alfonso, who had once stood so proudly on the bedrock of his power, now found the ground eroding beneath his feet. His armies, accustomed to fighting the fractured emirates, were shattered by the disciplined fanaticism of the Almoravid host. The great defeat at Sagradas was a mortal wound to Castilian pride and a dire omen for the future of the Christian kingdoms. Panic began to fester in the royal court at Leon. Generals who had once schemed for Rodrigo's exile now proved inept on the battlefield. The kingdom was bleeding, its borders shrinking under the relentless pressure from the south. The king saw the faces of his council, etched with fear, and knew that their strength was a hollow echo of the one men he had cast out. In the solitude of his chambers, the king was haunted by a ghost. It was the ghost of his own folly, the specter of the champion he had banished. To recall Rodrigo would be an admission of failure, a humiliation that would echo through every court in Christendom and Al-Andalus. But to not recall him would be to risk his entire kingdom. The decision was a bitter pill, a poison of pride he was forced to swallow. Before his grim-faced nobles, he gave the order. A royal envoy was to be dispatched, to find the mercenary lord, the traitor he had created, and to beg for the return of his sword. Not as a command, but as a plea from a king on the verge of ruin. The message found Rodrigo in his camp, a city of leather and steel pitched in the dust of the eastern frontier. He was no longer the Castilian knight, but a warlord who commanded a veteran army bound only to him. He received the king's richly dressed envoy not with deference, but with the cold, assessing gaze of an equal. He listened to the honeyed words of the king's request, the talk of shared faith and common enemies, and heard only the desperation beneath them. There was no flicker of patriotic fire in his breast, no surge of joy at the prospect of a homecoming. The exile had scoured all such sentiment from his soul. This was not a recall, it was a business proposition. He sent his answer back not with promises, but with terms. He would not return as a pardoned vassal to kneel at Alfonso's feet. He would return as an independent ally, his army under his sole command. He would fight the Almoravids, but he would choose his own battles, and the spoils of his victories, including any cities he might conquer, would be his alone. The terms were an insult, a demand for a king to treat a subject as a sovereign power. Yet, with the Almoravid armies threatening the heart of his kingdom, Alfonso had no choice but to agree. The pact was sealed, a contract between two kings, one born to a throne and one who had forged a crown from his own steel and will. Rodrigo's march west was not a return, but an invasion of a different sort. He was a power unto himself now, moving across a land that was once his home but was now merely a theater of war. He saw the familiar landscapes of Castile not with the eyes of a native son, but with the strategic calculus of a general assessing the terrain. His gaze, however, was not fixed on the king's immediate peril. His ambition, nurtured in the harsh wilderness of exile, had grown into something far grander. He saw the chaos of the Almoravid invasion not just as a threat, but as an opportunity. A chance to carve out a permanent kingdom for himself from the wreckage. His target was the jewel of the eastern coast, Valencia. A city of legendary wealth, famed for its fertile gardens, its bustling port, and its mastery of paper and silk. It was a prize coveted by emirs and kings, a decadent, politically fractured city-state ripe for the taking by a man with a singular, ruthless purpose. He turned his army not towards the king's battles, but towards the sun-drenched walls of Valencia. This would be his war, fought for his own gain. The contract with Alfonso was merely a convenience, a political shield that allowed him to operate freely while the king was occupied with the main Almoravid threat. The siege of Valencia was a masterpiece of relentless, patient brutality. He did not waste his men in foolish assaults against the formidable walls. Instead, he encircled the city, cut off its supplies, and began a slow, methodical process of strangulation. He laid waste to the surrounding huerta, the verdant gardens that fed the metropolis, turning a paradise into a barren wasteland. The war for the city was long and cruel. For months, he fought off relief armies, put down rebellions in his own camp, and tightened his grip on the starving populace. He was no longer just a brilliant field commander, he had become a master of siegecraft, of logistics, of the grim arithmetic of attrition. Finally, after nearly 2 years of suffocating pressure, the city broke. The gates were opened, not by force of arms, but by the hollow-eyed specter of famine. Rodrigo rode into the city he had conquered, and his personal banner, the lion of his lineage, was raised over the citadel. It was not the flag of Castile, nor of Zaragoza. It was his alone. He entered the Alcazar not as a general serving a distant king, but as its new master. The transformation was absolute. He had left Castile as an exiled vassal and returned to the stage of Iberia as a sovereign prince. He was beholden to no man, Christian or Muslim. He had made his own destiny. He established his rule with a pragmatist's touch, respecting the laws and customs of the city's diverse population. He was a harsh lord, but a just one, for he knew that a prosperous kingdom was a stronger one. He had ceased to be a sword for hire. He was now a ruler of men, the lord of his own domain, a king in all but name. Peace was not a spoil of victory. His throne in Valencia was a precarious peak surrounded by a sea of enemies. To the south, the Almoravid Empire seethed, viewing his Christian principality as a blasphemous intrusion into their lands. To the north, rival Christian lords and even his so-called ally, King Alfonso, watched his rise with envious, predatory eyes. Power had not brought him tranquility, only a larger cage to defend. The kingdom he had forged was an island in a tempest. Every day brought fresh threats, a skirmish on the border, a whispered plot within the city walls, the shadow of a new Almoravid fleet appearing on the horizon. He slept in his armor more often than not, the weight of his crown heavier than any helmet. He was a king, yes, but a king perpetually at war, his reign a long, drawn-out battle for survival. And then the storm he had long anticipated finally broke. A vast Almoravid army, a river of chanting zealots and Berber steel, surged up from the south under the command of a general famed for his cruelty and cunning. They were not here to raid, but to annihilate. They laid siege to Valencia, their camp a sprawling city of black tents that choked the life from the surrounding land. The defense was desperate from the outset. Rodrigo's forces, a hardened corps of veterans, were vastly outnumbered. He led the defense with a feverish energy, a whirlwind of command and action. He was on the walls at dawn, directing the catapults. He was in the armory at noon, inspecting the blades. He was leading furious sorties from the gates at dusk, a lion breaking from its lair to bloody the hunters. It was during one such charge, a chaotic melee of dust and screams just beyond the city's main gate, that fate delivered its final, treacherous blow. He was rallying a wavering line of spearmen, his voice a roar over the din, when a momentary gap opened in his shield wall. It was for less than a heartbeat, but it was enough. An arrow, loosed from a distant bough, flew true and struck him in the side, a biting sting just below the steel cuirass. He barely felt it at first, the adrenaline of battle a potent anesthetic. He broke the shaft and fought on, his sword a blur of silver, driving the enemy back from the gate. Only when the charge was done and the heavy doors boomed shut behind him did he feel the strange, cold fire spreading from the wound. He looked down and saw the dark, viscous poison already staining the arrowhead lodged in his flesh. He was carried to his chambers, the news of his wound spreading through the city faster than a flame. The finest physicians came, their faces grim as they examined the blackening flesh. They offered poultices and whispered prayers, but their eyes held no hope. He, who had survived 100 battles, knew the language of mortality. He saw his own death reflected in their helpless expressions. The pain was a rising tide, but his mind remained lucid, a shard of ice in a sea of agony. His life had been a series of calculated risks, of tactical gambles. Now he faced his final gambit, a strategy that reached beyond the grave. He knew his death, at this crucial moment, would be the final blow to the city's morale. The army would shatter. Valencia would fall. He sent the physicians away and called for his wife, Jimena, and his most trusted captains. She entered the room not with tears, but with a terrible, knowing calm in her eyes. She had been the anchor of his life, a woman of quiet strength who had endured his exile and shared his precarious triumph. She looked at him now, dying, and her face was a mask carved from stone. With what remained of his breath, he gave his last order. The words were quiet, rasping, but they filled the room with a chilling authority. He spoke not of his soul, nor of his legacy, but of the disposition of his body. His death was to be concealed. At dawn, his corpse, fully armed and armored, was to be mounted on his war-horse, Babieca, and lead the army in a final, all-out charge. His captains stared in horror, their faces pale with disbelief. To desecrate the body of their lord, to use him as a puppet in some ghastly spectacle. It was madness, an offense against God and man. They began to protest, their voices thick with grief and revulsion, but he silenced them with a single, furious glare, the last ember of his command flaring to life. But Jimena did not protest. She listened to his horrific plan, her gaze locked with his. In the terrible clarity of her grief, she understood the brutal necessity of it. It was the final, perfect expression of the man he had become, a leader whose will was so absolute that not even death itself could halt his final command. It was not madness, it was strategy. As his life ebbed away, he laid his hand on hers. It was a final, silent acknowledgement of the terrible burden he was placing upon her. Then the light faded from his eyes, and the great warrior, the Lord of Valencia, the legend known as El Cid, was dead. The silence that fell was heavier than any stone, a weight of grief and impending duty. Jimena did not weep. The time for tears was a luxury she could not afford. She rose, her movements precise and deliberate, and dismissed the stunned, grieving men from the chamber. She was alone now, with her husband's body and his last, monstrous will. A cold resolve settled over her, a purpose that froze her sorrow into a sharp, clear instrument. The work began in the dead of night, a secret and sacred profanity. With the help of 2 silent, loyal servants, she began to prepare the corpse. They washed the cooling flesh, a grotesque parody of a final bath. They forced the stiffening limbs into the ornate, polished steel of his finest parade armor, the armor of a prince, not a soldier. Each piece was a memory, each buckle a new wave of silent agony. The greaves that had protected his legs on 100 charges. The gauntlets that had held both a sword and her hand. The helmet, whose empty visor now stared into nothingness. She worked without hesitation, her hands steady, her face a blank canvas of resolve. Finally, they brought the armored body to the stables. They heaved the dead weight into the saddle of his great white war-horse. Babieca, sensing the unnatural coldness of its rider, shifted nervously, its eyes wide. With her own hands, Jimena took the ropes. She lashed his body to the saddle, cinching the straps so tight that he sat upright, a perfect effigy of a commander surveying the field. She secured his shield to his arm and wedged the hilt of his sword into his gauntlet, a king upon his throne of war, ready for one last ride. The great gates of Valencia groaned open in the grey, pre-dawn light, not for a desperate sortie, but for a procession of ghosts. And at its head, the dead Cid rode into battle. His armored corpse sat erect upon Babieca, a silent, iron effigy of command. His army followed, a river of men held together by a fragile dam of discipline against a flood of superstitious terror. Their charge began in an unholy silence. The Almoravid sentries peered through the mist, expecting another frantic raid. Instead, they saw a slow, inexorable advance. They saw the white warhorse, the famous banner of the lion, and the unmistakable figure of the Christian lord they had been told was dead. A whisper of disbelief became a murmur of fear, a contagion of doubt that spread through the front lines with supernatural speed. He did not raise his sword. He did not shout a battle cry. He simply rode forward, a vacant, terrifying judgment. For the Almoravid warriors, steeped in tales of jinns and ghouls, this was no mere man. This was an abomination, a corpse risen from the grave to claim its vengeance. The legend they had feared in life was infinitely more terrible in death. The Christian soldiers, marching behind their lifeless champion, were caught in a waking nightmare. They were the instruments of a dead man's will, their courage a strange alloy of loyalty and horror. Each step forward was an act of faith and a violation of nature. They marched toward the enemy, but their eyes were fixed on the rigid back of the corpse leading them. As the silent army closed the distance, the Almoravid line began to waver. Seasoned warriors, men who had faced death 100 times, felt their courage curdle into a primal dread. Their leaders screamed orders, trying to hold the formation, but their voices were lost in the growing clamor of panic. How do you fight a man who is already dead? How do you kill a ghost? The charge, when it finally came, was a surge of silent, desperate men. There was no cheer, only the thunder of hooves and the grim set of 1,000 jaws. They crashed into the enemy line, which did not break, but dissolved. It melted away in sheer terror as soldiers threw down their spears and shields and fled from the ghastly apparition at the head of the Christian host. The battle became a rout, and the rout became a slaughter. The dead man's army, fueled by a manic energy born of grief and dread, cut down the fleeing enemy without mercy. They were avenging their lord and exorcising their own terror in the same bloody strokes. The victory was absolute, a crushing, unbelievable triumph born from the most grotesque deception in the annals of war. The sun was high in the sky when the last of the enemy was scattered to the winds. The field was littered with the abandoned tools of war and the twisted bodies of the slain. The soldiers of Valencia stood panting in the sudden silence, their swords dripping, their minds reeling. They looked to their leader, still sitting motionless on his horse, and the full, chilling weight of their victory fell upon them. Slowly, reverently, they escorted their dead commander back into the city. They were drunk on a cocktail of relief and horror. They had survived. They had won. But their lord was a corpse tied to a horse. Their victory felt hollow, an orphan in the world. They carried the news of their impossible success to the citadel, to lay it at the feet of their lady, Jimena. But the citadel was silent. The heavy doors stood ajar, and no guards challenged their entry. A strange emptiness echoed in the stone halls. They moved through the courtyards and chambers, their calls for their lady met only by the whisper of the wind through the arches. A cold knot of unease began to tighten in their stomachs. They found her chambers empty, the bed unslept in, a fine veil left discarded on the floor. They searched the nurseries next, a rising sense of dread clawing at them. The children were gone. Their toys lay scattered, silent witnesses to a hasty departure. The silence of the palace was no longer empty, it was accusing. One of the captains, a man whose face was a mask of disbelief, forced the lock on the treasury door. The great iron-bound chests that had held the spoils of a lifetime of war, the gold of Zaragoza, the ransoms of counts, the wealth of Valencia, stood open. And they were all empty. The entire fortune of their principality was gone. The truth descended upon them then, a blow more stunning than any physical weapon. They had not been fighting for Valencia. They had been the instrument of a diversion. Their ghastly charge, their impossible victory, had been nothing more than a cover for an escape. Jimena had used her husband's last, horrific command to buy herself time. She had understood what they, in their grief and loyalty, had not. This victory was a fleeting illusion. Without its lord, Valencia was a tomb waiting to be sealed. The Almoravids would return, and King Alfonso's army was already marching, not to relieve them, but to claim the city for himself. A dead hero was no longer an obstacle, he was an inheritance to be seized. Jimena's loyalty had not been to a city of strangers or to an army of mercenaries. It had been to her children, to the survival of her bloodline. She had taken the gold, the only thing that now had value, and her children, the only thing that truly mattered, and had vanished, leaving the city, the army, and her husband's corpse to their fate. The victorious soldiers stood in the empty treasury, the cheers of the city they had just saved echoing faintly from outside. They were masters of a captured city they could not possibly hold. Their lord was dead, their lady had betrayed them, and their wealth was gone. They had won the battle, only to realize they had been the final, discarded pieces in a game they never knew they were playing.